Good afternoon. Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, dear participants of the round table. Today, on the 9th of August, all the world celebrates the Day of the Indigenous Peoples of the world. It was established in 1994 by the resolution of the UNO, and on this day there was the first meeting of the working group concerning indigenous populations to protect the rights of indigenous populations, and the subcommittee established its work, and it provided that we provide for the culture and special contribution of the indigenous populations to the world, and we understand the huge difficulties facing, and they are discriminated, and their rights are violated. And in the world now we have more than 370 million of people who represent indigenous population, and these peoples live in more than 90 countries, and they represent different languages and cultures, and they are only 5% of population of the world, and they have 50% of the poorest populations. And they continue to face many problems, and their rights are frequently violated. In order to attract attention of the broader public, power of different levels in different countries to the issues concerning indigenous peoples, and in order to focus the efforts to resolve their problems, this day was established in order that people in the world remembered about this category of people, about this category of population on our planet that takes care of our land. They are close to nature, to land, to earth. That's why we should remember about this. That's why on this day, usually they hold different cultural events. Indigenous people may provide information to other people about their culture, traditions, customs. Usually they hold round tables and also greet everyone on their native languages, and taking into account this day of indigenous people. And today in Ukraine, Crimean Tatars officially is the indigenous people of Ukraine. Also, there are different other indigenous peoples, and we should regulate the situation legally. They should be recognized as indigenous people. This is Karamchak and Karaims and Grigotoms and Urums. They are also from Crimea, and also in connection with this, constantly we should remember and remind to others that these issues at the national level also should be resolved. That's why today, using this opportunity, using this wonderful day, the International Day of Indigenous People, we are going to speak about those achievements that we have and about those drawbacks that should be resolved by our joint efforts. That's why we have such participants at our roundtable, well-known Ukrainian experts concerning the issues of indigenous peoples. I would like to present Natalia Belitser and Yulia Tyshchenko, expert of Crimean Tatar Center, PhD, Yevhen Khlobystov, and also the deputy head of Mejlis, Ilmi Umerov. To the left of me is the expert of UNO on Indigenous People, our close friend Loode, and he is also the expert on human rights and indigenous rights, and also Boris Babin, professor expert of Crimean Tatar Resource Center and leading specialist concerning the issues of the rights of indigenous peoples. And also I would like to give the floor to Ilmi Umerov, chairman of the board of the Crimean Tatar Resource Center and the member of the Mejlis of Crimean Tatar People. I would like to be brief. First, I would like to provide greetings from the head of Mejlis, and he has a meeting to attend to. That's why he is not here with us today. And based on the name of today's event, the implementation of rights of indigenous people in Ukraine and abroad, challenges and perspectives, I would like to have a different view on indigenous people's rights. Everyone speaks about problems of indigenous people, but I would like to say that the problem may appear in the country that do not respect natural rights of peoples, including indigenous peoples that live in the territory of the country. For example, Crimean Tatar people was formed in Crimea, and the majority of those who lived in the territory of the USSR territory in 1980s, 1990s, these people returned to Crimea. These people survived after deportation, but Ukrainian state did not resolve the main problem, the right for self-determination. So these people didn't implement its rights for self-determination. 15 or 20 years ago, if Crimea would be provided the status of statehood of Crimean Tatars or Crimean Tatar autonomy, or to provide them with some other form, maybe there won't be any occupation later on, occupation that was committed by the Russian Federation. So non-resolution of this main point resulted in big problems. Part of territories of the state was annexed, and there is a real war with the northern neighbor, and we could prevent it. And several words about what we can do. Not waiting for the occupation and restoration of territorial integrity of Ukraine. Not waiting until Russia removes its forces from Crimea. Ukraine needs to consider this issue and resolve it. I believe that now good conditions were created to resolve this issue. We need to consider it in the Verkhovna Rada, in the parliament of Ukraine, to introduce changes into the constitution, to adopt 2 laws on indigenous peoples and about the status of Crimean Tatar people. And this provides additional arguments for Ukraine in restoration of its territorial integrity. Firstly, for the occupation of Crimea. And at international platforms, Ukraine will have additional arguments to help restore the rights of Crimean Tatar people, in this case, Crimean Tatar people, indigenous people, and the restoration of its rights for self-determination. So I provided this opinion. Usually they do not speak about it. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you good work. Thank you very much. We continue our work. And I would like to remind to you that we will have Skype connections, and we will have connections with well-known experts of UNO concerning the issues of indigenous people and international law, and also we will have connections with representatives of indigenous peoples and experts on indigenous people and representatives of Indians of the United States of America, and with the representatives of the European Association on self-determination of indigenous people, and we will have a very good discussion. And now I would like to give the floor to our friend, long-time friend, who is the expert on indigenous people. He is expert of the Estonian Institute for Human Rights, Oliver Loode.
Thank you, Eskender. Hello to everybody. And wanted to start by saying I appreciate everything that Mr. Umerov said in his brief statement, both about the policy of Ukraine before 2014 and the opportunities that lie ahead right now. But I would like to focus in my prepared statement on the occasion of 5 years since Ukraine endorsed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, including accomplishments that this has brought, but also opportunities ahead. So, but first of all, I'm really honored to be here on this International Day of World's Indigenous Peoples. It is also nice that this roundtable discussion has become a kind of a tradition in Ukraine. I believe it is held for the third year in a row, and I'm glad to be participating in it. So this year, the International Day of World's Indigenous Peoples coincides with not only 5 years of the illegal occupation of Crimea by Russia, but also with 5 years since Ukraine officially recognized Crimean Tatars as indigenous people of Ukraine, and since it endorsed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, an event that deserves some attention and analysis also today. So I will therefore briefly talk about, firstly, how I see the meaning and significance of Ukraine's endorsement of the UN Declaration in 2014, talk about some of the expectations that I personally had about how Ukraine could start implementing the declaration until now, and most importantly, suggest 3 simple but potentially impactful opportunities for Ukraine in this field for the next 5 years. But let me start by recalling how and under which circumstances Ukraine endorsed the UN Declaration in 2014. But first, some historical context. So at the time of the adoption of the UN Declaration in 2007, Ukraine was one of the 11 countries that abstained from the voting of the UN General Assembly that adopted the declaration, and as such Ukraine aligned itself with the Russian Federation and other countries, some other countries. At the time of the voting, however, the UN Declaration was endorsed by 143 countries and voted against by 4. These were USA, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. But all of those countries that initially voted against the declaration have now reversed their position and support it. Ukraine's position at the time, in 2007, to abstain from endorsing UN declaration was likely affected by partly perhaps modeling its position after the Russian Federation, who also abstained, but also about or by Ukraine's unease at the time about recognizing collective rights, including the rights or the right to self-determination of Crimean Tatars. Crimean Tatars by then, by 2007, had become active participants in the international Indigenous Peoples movement. They were attending the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues and other venues. However, Ukraine as a state did not recognize Crimean Tatars as indigenous people of Ukraine back then. Moreover, statements of Crimean Tatar representatives at UN venues, like the Permanent Forum, were known for their criticism towards Ukraine that, in the view of Crimean Tatar representatives, was falling short in the recognition and protection of Crimean Tatars' rights. It is also known that representatives of Ukraine's mission at the UN in New York attended Permanent Forum sessions mostly in a reactive capacity to defend itself against some criticism by Crimean Tatar representatives. But Ukraine did not engage in a constructive dialogue, or let alone take some kind of a proactive stance at the UN Permanent Forum. So this was Ukraine before 2007, before the UN Declaration was adopted, but also before 2014, when it eventually endorsed the UN Declaration. But this period between 2007 and 2014 was crucial from the perspective of the Indigenous Peoples movement globally and the role of the United Nations in promoting Indigenous peoples' rights. During this time, the role and importance of the UN Declaration grew, and it became to be widely seen as the global consensus on the minimum standards of indigenous peoples' human rights. The fact that 4 original no voters reversed their position to support the UN Declaration further supported this process. And while the UN Declaration as a whole is not a legally binding document, like a convention or a treaty, at least some elements of it are now effectively parts of the international human rights law. So the UN Declaration is a document that sets a general framework for dialogues between indigenous peoples and states, between indigenous peoples and corporation, and over time its importance internationally has grown, something that cannot be said about all resolutions that the UNGA adopts. And perhaps the most important substantive point that the UN Declaration makes is its affirmation that indigenous peoples are indeed peoples. Peoples as opposed to, for example, ethnic minorities or communities or groups and so on. And so, just to make sure, peoples as народ. Коренной народ, а не этническое меньшинство или что-то такое. And by virtue of that, indigenous peoples have collective rights, including the right to self-determination, just as other peoples, which is a key principle of the founding international human rights treaties. And all other rights listed in the UN Declaration, they logically follow from this right to self-determination. It should also be added that the right to self-determination of indigenous peoples can be exercised always and only within the borders of existing sovereign states. And this right to self-determination cannot be used as a pretext to justify any kind of separatism. And any fears by states that this could be the case are completely unjustified. So it was in the backdrop of this growing global acceptance and support for the UN Declaration, certainly among indigenous peoples, but also increasingly among UN member states, that Crimea was illegally occupied by the Russian Federation, which in turn led to a swift change in the position of Ukraine to firstly recognize Crimean Tatars via a Verkhovna Rada resolution in March 2014 as indigenous people, and secondly, to very soon afterwards to announce its endorsement of the UN Declaration to the then Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, which happened in May 2014. So I was a first-year expert member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in 2014, and I had the privilege to witness the announcement of Ukraine's endorsement of the UN Declaration by its then Vice Ambassador, in front of hundreds of representatives of indigenous peoples, as well as UN agencies and member states. And this session was also attended by Mr. Mustafa Jamilov. I can attest personally that this was an emotional moment for many delegates of the Permanent Forum, in particular for many friends of Crimean Tatars and friends of the new, more European-minded Ukraine. It was also a moment full of hope that Ukraine will just as swiftly begin implementing key principles of the UN Declaration domestically, to the extent that it was possible in the face of Crimea's temporarily occupied status. Of course, there were then and always will remain skeptics, including among the Crimean Tatar people, according to whom this Ukraine's change in policy was just political opportunism that did not reflect a deeper change in attitudes, policies, and eventually legislation. But personally, I have always believed that this moment was indeed a start of genuine change. Now, what was a reasonable expectation back in 2014 in terms of what Ukraine could, and maybe could not do? Okay, so what was a reasonable expectation back then, in 2014? What Ukraine could do, and maybe could not do, to begin implementing the UN Declaration domestically, assuming Crimea's occupied status will not change. Of course, the situation of Ukraine was uniquely difficult, in the sense that no matter how much it wanted, it was not possible for Ukraine to actually protect the rights of Crimean Tatars living in Crimea while Crimea is occupied. So in that sense, anybody's expectations about what Ukraine could do should have been quite low. However, there was still much that Ukraine could do to begin implementing the UN Declaration, already starting in May 2014. And especially after the so-called World Conference on Indigenous Peoples that was held at the UN General Assembly in September 2014. This conference, or the outcome document of this conference, called upon all UN member states to begin implementing the UN declaration domestically by aligning their domestic legislation and policies with the UN declaration. And Ukraine supported that document. So in general, I would highlight 4 areas in which I think it was reasonable to expect Ukraine to make significant progress during, let's say, 2014-2019, in terms of implementing the UN declaration. Firstly, it's awareness building. So Ukraine has had an opportunity to raise awareness of Ukraine's own indigenous peoples and their rights, both domestically and internationally. Something that I always emphasize is the use of language or political rhetoric. So adoption of the UN declaration terminology in Ukraine's political discourse, including consistent use of the term indigenous people instead of ethnic minority or community, is the least that Ukraine had an opportunity to do. Thirdly, legislation. Ukraine had an opportunity to adopt national legislation about its indigenous peoples and their status, this way reaffirming and solidifying the resolution of Verkhovna Rada for the next decades at least. And finally, diplomacy, international diplomacy. Ukraine had an opportunity to prioritize the presence of Ukraine as a state and Ukrainian experts at UN mechanisms like the Permanent Forum, expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, and others, through the work of its diplomatic missions. And I think more generally, Ukraine has had an opportunity to, through these mechanisms, through these activities, to create a kind of a certainty among Crimean Tatars, especially Crimean Tatars in Crimea, that if and when Crimea is deoccupied, that would result in a fundamentally different relationship between Crimean Tatars and the Ukrainian state, a relationship where Crimean Tatars' rights, including right to self-determination, are fully respected, that there will be no fallback to the so-called old times. But now let's see 5 years after Ukraine actually endorsed the declaration, so what has changed? What has been the progress? Of course, there have been some positives. Ukraine continues to recognize Crimean Tatars as indigenous people of Ukraine. There is a support for Crimean Tatars advocacy efforts at the UN and other international venues. And I would say that Crimean Tatars and Ukraine, they work together as a team. But still, despite this, my overall sentiment about Ukraine's progress in implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples during these past 5 years is disappointment. So first and foremost, there still is no legislation that would enshrine the Verkhovna Rada's resolution from March 2014 and Ukraine's ensuing endorsement of the UN Declaration, even though this was requested by Mejlis already in March 2014. So this means that from a formal point of view, Ukraine's political and diplomatic activity in this field has not really had a legally binding nature. Also, it seems there was enough time to draft and adopt such legislation, but it wasn't done, so the question is why. Secondly, Ukraine on an official level has been inconsistent in the usage of the term indigenous people when referring to Crimean Tatars. Often still, especially in international documents like UN General Assembly resolutions, Ukraine refers to Crimean Tatars as, for example, a community. And this is confusing. The question is not just about words or language, it's about the meaning behind the words. So whenever Ukraine itself uses or allows to use in international documents the term community when referring to Crimean Tatars, this sets into doubt the seriousness of Ukraine in recognizing the right to self-determination of Crimean Tatars, because communities do not have a right to self-determination. People do, indigenous people do. And thirdly, I would have expected that by now Ukraine would have strengthened its presence and influence in at least one of the 3 United Nations mechanisms working on indigenous peoples, whether it is the UN Permanent Forum or the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples or something else. But the reality is that this has not happened, even though I have good information to state that Ukraine has had a very good, very realistic opportunity to nominate and successfully nominate its independent expert to the United Nations Permanent Forum next composition from 2020 to 2022. But Ukraine, unfortunately, just gave that opportunity away, and this is something I'm very sad about, because also in our collaboration with the Crimean Tatar Resource Center, in the document was called the Public Diplomacy Strategy of Crimean Tatars, this was set as a very clear goal that Ukraine should strengthen its presence in those UN mechanisms. And why did that not happen? This is not clear. So looking ahead, I think there is clearly an opportunity for the new authorities, the new political powers in Ukraine, to improve the way that Ukraine is implementing the UN Declaration and its principles, building on the resolutions and decisions from 2014 and some of the progress that has been done in the meantime. And I would suggest three simple areas. First, consistent use of language. Consistently refer to Crimean Tatars as indigenous peoples of Ukraine, avoid other euphemisms to the extent possible, and request the same from Ukraine's international partners and friends. This is a simple, cost-free, but effective way for Ukraine to reaffirm that it indeed views Crimean Tatars as people with the right to self-determination. Secondly, legislation. There clearly is an opportunity to adopt legislation with respect to Ukraine's indigenous peoples and in line with the international norms and law. And thirdly, diplomacy. I urge Ukraine to take a more proactive, more competent role in Ukraine's participation in the work of United Nations mechanisms working on indigenous peoples. Ensure that Ukraine will have at least one expert member in the UN Permanent Forum for the term 2023 to 2025. Ensure that Ukraine will at some point have an expert member in the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, and officially invite the special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples on a country mission to Ukraine. My understanding is that the new authorities in Ukraine are keen to implement changes, to turn a kind of a new page for Ukraine. Some of these goals are massive, they require major structural changes and can be very costly. But improving the way that Ukraine is implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is mostly a matter of political will and self-discipline. It will not burden Ukraine's state budget at all. But the results of this work can have real positive impact on Ukraine's territorial integrity and national security, as these steps will shape the way Crimean Tatars, especially Crimean Tatars living in occupied Crimea, view life in a future deoccupied and liberated Crimea. And these attitudes, what they are, should be viewed by Ukraine, in my view, as a matter of national security. And maybe that is the most important reason why Ukraine should take the UN Declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples and the implementation of its principles seriously and make it a national priority. Thank you for attention, and on behalf of the Estonian Institute of Human Rights and myself, I congratulate you all on the International Day of World's Indigenous Peoples.
Thank you very much, Oliver.
We thank Oliver, and I would like to mention that we have time limits. Now more than 7 minutes because we have many participants. Is Helen Nieberg is ready? Are we ready? Helen Nieberg represents the European Indigenous Peoples Alliance, and recently the European Alliance initiated the support of Crimean Tatars in order to include to the documents of the expert mechanism the issues of Crimean Tatars in Ukraine, and the initiative of Helen was to deliver such a campaign in the framework of expert mechanism on indigenous peoples. So, please.
I guess
Helena, good day. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you. Hello. Please. From Zurich, Switzerland. My name is Helena Nieberg, and I bring you the greetings from Incomedios, one of the oldest European human rights organizations for the rights of indigenous peoples, I also bring you greetings from the European Alliance for the Self-Determination of Indigenous Peoples. Thank you for the honor to participate in this roundtable on a very important day for Indigenous peoples worldwide. And also let me take the opportunity to congratulate the world's Indigenous peoples for this International Day, to celebrate their strength and stamina to struggle for their rights. We know of the importance of Indigenous peoples for the life on this planet, and this was also stressed by Eskender Bariev, and we share in a struggle that has not ended yet, as we know. And I would like to commend Oliver Loode, who explained everything very clearly. So in particular, I want to stress the inalienable rights of Indigenous peoples of all of the Crimean Tatars, wherever they live, and whose cause we have been supporting for many years. I particularly remember the contributions of the Crimean Tatars delegates when the Indigenous peoples at the UN in Geneva were working out the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and Oliver Loode stressed this importance of this unique document that it has become during the time of war, and no other document of the United Nations structures and mechanisms has been actually worked out so long, over 20 years, until it was finally passed by the United Nations General Assembly in 2007. So just by the mere fact that Indigenous peoples, including Crimean Tatars, have been there, sitting there for more than 20 years, starting in 1982, to work out this document makes it so unique and particularly important. And as I said, the Crimean Tatars have been part of these UN mechanisms, and they have been sharing their experiences in an incredible history of violation, discrimination, forced displacement, deportation, racism, that unfortunately has not ended till today. And unfortunately, their situation can be very well compared to the situation of much too many of other Indigenous peoples worldwide who have experienced the same history of violation of their rights. And this is why we, as the European Alliance and as Incommunities, we underline on this very day of celebration that Indigenous peoples should not become the plaything of political interests that use their lives, ancestral territory, and cultural, political, and economic rights for their own power games. And this respect, I'm looking forward to more contributions, and I would like to also take the opportunity to wish Crimean Tatars, all of the Crimean Tatars, all the best for the future. And I would also like to acknowledge our solidarity in the struggle from here onwards. And thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Helena. Thank you for your participation. Thank you. To be continuous. And сейчас я хочу предоставить слово.
Now I would like to give the floor back in Kiev. I would like to give the floor to Khlobystov Yevgeny, and he's the expert of Crimean Tatar Center. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm really glad to participate in this honorable event, and I would like to thank the organizers. I would like to say several words on the prospects of Indigenous people in Ukraine and why there is sense to speak about this issue in depth today. Because the rights of Indigenous peoples, they are not adhered to not only in Ukraine but in many countries, and what happened in Crimea is a bright indicator that the occupying state violates the rights of indigenous peoples. And when we speak about indigenous peoples, including Crimean Tatar people, this is officially recognized indigenous people in Ukraine. We are speaking about the occupation of Crimea and return of Crimea to Ukraine. We should elaborate several important documents. First, we need to have a national strategy of deoccupation. The strategy that envisages sustainable development of Crimea after return to Ukraine. Second issue, an obligatory issue concerning politics. I would like to support Ilmi Umerov and to say that Crimean Tatar people need to have a special status, and the provision of the special status to them will provide an opportunity to resolve this problem of recognition of Tatar people. This status of Crimean people should not be questioned in the future. So also we should have humanitarian policy concerning Crimea, concerning their adaptation and increase of their opportunities for their self-actualization, and this issue is not properly resolved in Ukraine. Fourth issue, we should pay attention to the economy of Crimea, what it should be when Crimea is a part of Ukraine again. There is no answer, so we go back to the first issue. We do not have proper comprehensive strategy of what Crimea should look like after the occupation. Economy should be based on sustainable development and the maximum involvement of indigenous peoples into economic processes. Thus, we should say about the program of economic integration based on sustainable development, and to elaborate such a program. The second this is the first document after the occupation. And what is important for us today? Media activity. People should not forget about Crimea. We should provide more information in the media about Crimea. Today we speak a lot about east of Ukraine, about Donbas, and we should continue to provide information about Donbas, but we do not speak a lot about Crimea. Today, we should initiate such public discussions, active discussions, round tables, conferences, in order to raise this issue and discuss this issue. And through these discussions, we may identify what Crimea would look like after the occupation, and to make Crimea attractive in order to integrate it into the world markets. And indigenous people of Crimea should have opportunities for self-development and to be competitive in the labor markets. The return of Crimea will depend on political situation in Russia, but we should do everything possible in order to do this, and in order to see that harmonious future. And we gather here today for this, and we create special environment in Crimean Tatar Resource Center to identify what Crimea should look like after the occupation in the future. The main focus should be on the rights of indigenous peoples and the social and political and economic development. So I believe that we will have many interesting views here in the hall among speakers and via Skype, and I wish everyone success in order to return Crimea as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Swepston.
Do we have Dr. Lee Swepston online on Skype connection? I would like to find out. Please help me. No. Yes.
From the International Labor Office.
Good afternoon, Dr. Lee. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. We're glad to see you.
I'm glad to be here.
We speak about Indigenous People Day, about problems, and you are a good specialist about ILO, and please.
Thank you. I'm glad to be with you. I've been following your discussions via the internet, and I'm speaking to you from my home in France. I have to say that many of the points already made, especially by Mr. Loode, have enabled me to make briefer comments than I might have otherwise. I am the former senior advisor on human rights at the International Labor Organization. I was there from the beginning of the international discussions on indigenous peoples in the early 1970s, and took part in all of those discussions at the UN and in other organizations with indigenous peoples themselves and with the various international organizations. Mr. Loode has referred to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This is an enormously important document, an international law. There is, however, another document that has not yet been mentioned, which is the only ratifiable international convention on the rights of indigenous and tribal peoples. That is the ILO's Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention of 1989, number 169. This was adopted with the participation of the entire UN system, of indigenous peoples themselves, and of others who are interested in the subject. One of the things I would like to mention most clearly is that I would hope excuse me, I would hope that the Ukraine would return to considering whether or not to ratify this convention. What are the advantages of it? Well, unlike the declaration, this entails an active and close supervision of the implementation of the convention by the ILO's supervisory bodies. Ukraine, in fact, is already engaged with the ILO in many ways and has ratified 71 other ILO conventions, so that there is no reason not to return to consider this one, which is of such importance to your peoples and to the country as a whole. Convention number 169 was adopted in order to try to put into hard international law, if I can say that, some of the rights and duties pertaining to indigenous and tribal peoples in international law. It involves recognition. It involves the right to participation and consultation. It discusses land rights and the uses of resources, education, health, and many other relevant points. The UN Declaration, which has a more aspirational take, was built on the provisions of Convention 169, and of course has taken them further in an aspirational point of view. From the benefits of the ILO Convention is, as I say, precise obligations in international law and the opening of a dialogue with the ILO on how they are implemented, along with assistance from the International Labor Office on how to go about implementing them. I will not go further at this point because so much has already been said and you still have much to say. Beyond this, I only encourage Ukraine and the indigenous peoples of Ukraine to make use of all of the tools available and to continue to work for the improvement of the situation of the indigenous peoples of Ukraine and the full recognition of their right to exist, their right to participate, and their right to flourish. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Do you have any questions for Dr. Lee? Do you have? Pani Natalia, please.
Thank you, Mr. Eskender Bariev, thank you, and we would like to share with you that you shared your considerations, what we can expand from the new regime of Ukraine. Thank you, Mr. Lee.
Thank you for participation. Thank you for your time. Thank you very much.
A great pleasure.
You are welcome, Ms. Natalia. I would like to share my observations. We can see that there are many representatives of international expert community here. All of them accent the importance of the International Day of Indigenous People. At the same time, this audience we see no representatives of old or new authorities of Ukraine, and this is the first time this year when no civil body does not take part in the event connected to the World's Day of Indigenous People. In 2014, we for the first time celebrated this World's Indigenous People Day. It was at Ukrinform venue. The journalists mentioned that the number of representatives of civil authorities was huge. So the dynamics now is negative, and Ukraine's monitor, excuse me. Here we see representative of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. I am sorry, I am ready that we have representative. The Department of Foreign Ministry of Foreign Affairs for working with international organizations. Then I am sorry for my mistake, and there is also representative of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and representatives of the Ministry of Culture of Ukraine. I looked at the organizers and I did not see anybody who I saw previous years. I'm sorry. What can we expect from the new regime, from the new authorities in new? Usually there is a trend to criticize the predecessors, and not enough attention is paid to the sad fact that the expert community has already prepared, including the expert group of Constitutional Commission has drafted the 2 bills and proposals of amendments to the Section 9 of the Constitution of Ukraine, but they have not been considered by the Constitution Commission, and they have not been passed at the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine of previous convocation, despite the resolution of 20th March 2014 clearly says to adopt relevant legislation as soon as possible within the fast period. Indigenous people's rights is a very specific domain. Maybe I'm wrong, but I do not see Ukrainian representatives of Ukrainian advocates who advocate for the protection of rights of Crimean Tatar peoples in occupied Crimea, but they work more on the violations, on the abuse of indigenous individuals' rights. But the indigenous people's rights, this is collective rights, and first of all, the rights for self-determination in the context of Crimea and Ukraine via the mechanism of creating own autonomy of Crimean Tatar people. So, understanding this fact that the occupation of Crimea problem and the new level of democracy and rule of law in Ukraine, they are interconnected. And they are connected not only with the provision of autonomy to Crimean Tatar peoples in Crimea. What we observe so far, there are declarations of the political advisor to President Zelensky, Mikita Paturai. He said that Crimean Tatar peoples deserve autonomy, and we should give the status to Crimean Tatar peoples. But this is not, this should not be a gift, a privilege. This is an unalienable right of indigenous peoples. This is a mechanism of exercising the right for self-determination. I think this understanding is lacking. This link, this connection between the rights of indigenous people and the occupation of Crimea and the establishing of national autonomy of Crimean Tatar peoples in this was mentioned by the leader of Crimean Tatar people, Mustafa Dzhemilov, when he mentioned that in his opinion there is this understanding is lacking. The understanding of the whole complex of whole set of problems connected to Crimean Tatar peoples is lacking. What can we do? We are civil activists and the expert community who have been many years addressing the issues of indigenous peoples and who are represented here at this table in this audience. Professor Babin has many publications and books on this topic, and many and he took part in the development of draft laws and amendments to the section 10 of the Constitution of Ukraine. The proposals are we can elaborate a joint recommendations to the new regime. I don't know what was delivered in Truskovets on the training. They say that it was the basics of constitutional rights, but what was not taught there, it was the legal basis of what indigenous people's status means and what will be consequences and impacts. On regular basis, workshops will be held, so we would like to propose a workshop on this topic, or lectures on this topic, or a training on this topic, maybe using such tools as SWOT analysis, so that the decision on establishing in the occupied Crimea of the national autonomy of Crimean Tatars would be more well-grounded decision which has a basis in legislation, we can draft a program of such a training or workshop or lectures and submit the program to the work group head and the head of the committee of the Servant of the People Party, which seems to be a prototype of committee of Verkhovna Rada on indigenous peoples and occupied territories of Crimea and Donbass. We can disseminate the manual during our training, which contains main basic knowledge of international law and on the situation of Ukraine and why indigenous people's rights are important for Ukraine. Among recommendations, and I would like to accent on an important sphere. International monitoring bodies during the years of 2000s in their reports on Ukraine insistently recommended to Ukraine to consider the opportunity to ratify the Convention of International 169 International Labor Organization, but the authorities did not make these steps. This would be a good chance for the new power, for the new regime to demonstrate the understanding of importance of such a step, and this item, Convention 169, is desirable to be included into the recommendations of international community on the occasion of this event of the World's Day of Indigenous Peoples. Thank you for attention. Thank you, Ms. Natalia. You touched a very important topic. What new MPs are learning now, and it would be good if Crimean Tatar organizations will draft some programs, because we have some workshops and we are the organization who protect the rights of Crimean Tatar peoples. And we are ready to help you in drafting such programs. And in the context of activities in international institutions such as the United Nations and the ILO, we are ready to prepare the trainings for our MPs, so that the MPs have basis so that they know indigenous people's rights and other issues such as political rights, environmental rights of citizens. Do we have Melitopol on Skype? Yes, we would like to give the floor to Melitopol representatives of indigenous peoples. They would like to greet us, and we will greet them on the occasion of the World's Day of Indigenous Peoples.
Елена Семеновна,
Good afternoon.
мы рады приветствовать вас. Поздравляем с Международным днем.
We greet you with the International Day of Indigenous People. We see that you gathered today, and we wish you success in your work. And also, We would like to hear from you. We are listening. So this is a cultural capital. This is the only city of Ukraine that has strategy of development of different indigenous peoples and ethnicities. And we gathered here to celebrate the International Day of World's Indigenous People. And we have here folk costumes. Our young people wear it. Please, operator, show them. Also, these are our elders in national costumes. We have representatives of other ethnicities, and today we do not only celebrate, we speak about the problems of indigenous peoples of the world. And I would like to greet all 370 million of indigenous people. They have different cultures, 5,000 different languages, and we should discuss what we should do. So, greetings from Melitopol, from Tatar Committee, and we give the floor to our representatives. Good afternoon, dear compatriots. I wish you success. I wish you good health. And we are sure that we'll be united in our struggle. Connection is really bad. About the law on indigenous peoples, about Crimean Tatars, Krimchaks and Karems. Supreme Council, the Parliament should consider proper status to Crimean Tatars, to preserve our culture, our language, and our history. I wish all good to you. Thank you very much. So this is not only a celebration for us, we are speaking about the problems. Now, the floor is given to Yuri Makarov. He would like to say several words about the problems of indigenous peoples. Good afternoon, dear representatives of the meeting. We discuss different issues during this event, mainly the treatment of the state of those indigenous peoples. According to law, we are indigenous peoples, and this issue should be considered during the nearest sessions of the parliament. This issue should be resolved. And we consider the establishment of the committee at the Supreme Council concerning indigenous peoples to develop peoples who live in the territory of Ukraine. We would like that these issues be resolved quickly and with the high quality. This is what I wanted to say. Thank you. And also we are joined by one more representative concerning our Melitopol's discussions. Good afternoon. This year we initiated the nomination of the candidate to the Supreme Council, and one of the nominees became the deputy of the 9th convocation of the parliament. And the initiative is that there should be a committee at the Supreme Council, the Committee on Nationalities, and there should be representatives of ethnic groups, those who were elected to the parliament, and this committee should focus on such issues. First one, creation of the ministry or state committee on nationalities that will manage these issues at the state level, national and inter-ethnic policy. This committee should work on these issues and should prepare draft law on national minorities in Ukraine. And the law that was adopted in 1994 does not correspond to the interests of ethnic minorities. And we want to have the law on this policy in this area and to create national autonomies in the places where there is compact residence of some ethnic minorities. Unfortunately, but this is not about newly elected president. During Poroshenko's rule and during Yanukovych's rule, they didn't have proper meetings of the committee concerning these issues. So we wish you success, and we would like to wish you success during your meeting. I would like to say that according to international law, indigenous people and national minorities, these are different terms. And we should actively work with the representatives of indigenous peoples, as with minorities, and with politicians in order to have clear understanding about these terms and the measures. And today, we consider to have national plans of actions to protect and support indigenous peoples, and this is based on the convention, on the declaration of UNO on human rights. Now the floor is given to Ms. I represent the Center of Political Resources and Center of Strategic Institute. We deal with issues of indigenous peoples and protection of rights. A lot has been said. So this is Yulia Tyshchenko, director of the Ukrainian National Center for Policy Studies. I believe that opportunities are lost concerning comprehensive legislation on indigenous people. Starting 2014, you may Google it. Starting 2014, we consider the same list of proposals concerning indigenous peoples. We discuss it during roundtables concerning reintegration strategy and about introduction of changes to the constitution. Some political slogans and promises are voiced, but nevertheless, during these 5 years, there were no proper legislative changes. And thanks to the Ministry of Culture, some packages of draft documents were elaborated. And we thank the working group of the Constitutional Commission, but there was no proper embodiment of these drafts. And of course, we should continue our work. But what was the reason? Why nobody was publicly against, but the process was delayed? Only discussions that are really important were held. And also we should involve stakeholders from the government. And due to them, some draft laws were developed and communication happened. And I believe that political will was lacking, as they say, and also there was no proper interest of the officials. Maybe there was no clear understanding that the law on indigenous peoples, this is connected with human rights. This is the right of people that we have in 3 other articles of our constitution, and Parliament and President, they should be active, and there is a strategy that is in effect until 2020. Some steps were created, some milestones were established that should have been implemented. I do not share the pessimism of Natalia, that there is no understanding. Do we have enough understanding to move this process forward? I do not know. It is difficult to say. But people understand that this issue is serious. The series of indigenous peoples and the constitutional process concerning Crimea. Whether we can make it priority and there's the occupation policy, including the component of communication, protection of rights of indigenous people, proper programs of the government concerning this issue, also communication with donors and programs of technical assistance that would work in this area, not only at the level of adoption of documents, but also at the level of the implementation of the policies. Also, the issue for discussion, what will be next with the state service on the issues of nationalities that was created, nationalities and religions, whether they would have financing for next year, and what special programs may exist. So there are many elements at the operational level. So now we didn't record this clear view how it would develop in the future. I believe that our activity should be consolidated. I completely agree here with Natalia, because there are many different meetings and there is lack of consolidated opinion concerning promotion of this topic and legislation and constitutional process. And here there should be proper advocacy in the media and at the level of different other networks. So it is not enough, for example, to create some brochure. So maybe they can discuss it, but whether they would agree not to have just wonderful slogans, but to implement the policy. So we should have a consolidated plan of the advocacy campaign that we should deliver, connected with the constant communication and provision of information to stakeholders and the work with different stakeholders, including political parties in the parliament. Also, we should advocate the issue concerning Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights and National Minorities, if we have such a committee. I hope that they will have it. And also humanitarian and information policies. Yes, there is, let's say, maturity is the wrong word in the context. There is some core, but there can be different understandings of the current situation. We should analyze the situation in order not to lose 5 next years, the opportunities. This is not even a window of opportunity. This is half-open window of opportunity, something less than a window. We should, I would like to address Eskender. If you prepare some addresses, some requests, you may involve different organizations that work in the same area, that support you. I propose to unite our efforts, informational and communicational resources, all of them, because we have the same understandings of the values that should be promoted and they should be campaigned for.
Thanks, Ms. Yulia. Yes, we should work jointly and actively. There are draft laws which has not yet been registered, although the Ministry of Culture should have been developed, should have developed this law, but everything is still not done, and there is a mandate on indigenous people. They can conduct, expert mechanism can conduct research in various countries, and we have contacts and we have good developments, and I hope that together with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine we shall make an official request on country visits so that expert assessment of our national legislation is taken in the context of indigenous people so that we work more clearly. Do we have Vyacheslav Lombroso on connection, Skype connection? Good afternoon, Vyacheslav. Vyacheslav Lombroso is the representative of the Crimean people. I shall give the floor to Boris Babin because we have problem with connection. We try once again to connect by Skype with Mr. Lombroso. I'm giving the floor to Professor, expert of Crimean Tatar Resource Center, Boris Babin. First of all, dear colleagues, I would like to greet everyone with the World's Day of Indigenous Peoples, because this is a global holiday which is of planet importance, and history of celebration of this day in Ukraine we have, because since 2010, several years, the celebrations of Indigenous Peoples Day took place, and we had representatives of Euro-Asian Indigenous Peoples organizations. So this day celebration started not in 2014 but in 2010, but talking about very scarce successes of Ukraine in this domain. It is understandable, because Ukraine took example of the aggressor country which has its own understanding on what indigenous peoples are, which is different of the one of the definition of the United Nations, and I am afraid that we continue to follow this path, and now we do not know why we have so scarce successes, but proceeding from the UN Declaration of Indigenous Peoples' Rights, the role of the UN mechanism is huge. Ukraine pays not enough attention to the work of these United Nations bodies, and I hope we will strengthen Ukraine's role. Also, despite that Mejlis of Crimean Tatar People was recognized the representative of this body since 1990s, as well as Crimean Peoples organizations. We were at the very beginning of formation of standards in the field of indigenous people's rights. I am sure that in the format which is compliance with international law, Ukraine will continue working on indigenous people's rights standards. The relationship between all indigenous peoples of the world, which are often fighting with over-controlling states. In this year, Ukraine made a statement condemning Russian Federation discriminating the indigenous peoples of Ukraine on occupied territories, but the Russian Federation, even when it has so weird interpretation of international laws, it has legislation in place on indigenous people's rights. So I will be very interested to observe and monitor for the development of legislation in Ukraine, and the communication between Ukrainian reality and what is happening in Geneva and New York. I will observe the communications, and I hope that this process will be strengthened and we will find synergy, and Ukraine will have legislation protecting the indigenous people's rights in Ukraine, and will provide efficient mechanisms which will give example to other countries where indigenous peoples live, and will be exercised in Crimea after the occupation. Thank you, Mr. Bariev. Do we have Pavel Sulenziga on Skype connection. We have Vyacheslav Lombroza now. Good afternoon. Vyacheslav Lombroza is a representative of Crimean Peoples. It is Indigenous Peoples of Crimea. We are very glad to see you, Vyacheslav. You can greet us because we are very short of time. Good afternoon. Kilmiaga, Eskender, and all those present at the event. I would like to share my opinion on the subject matter. First, I'd like to say that it is very sad that this day we celebrate not in Crimea, not in our joint home, and the occupation of Crimea should become one more reason to consolidate our efforts. The truth and international law is on our side, and Ukraine should understand that exercising the indigenous people's rights is one of the ways to restore integrity, territorial integrity of Ukraine. Crimean and Crimean peoples are diverse cultures and also the tool to restore justice. Every patriot of Ukraine should uphold the rights of indigenous peoples who in the conditions of occupation try to preserve their heritage and their culture. As my grandfather said, when the task, when the problem is complex, we should work step by step until we achieve solution of the problem, and we should protect, we should fight for our indigenous people's rights. Crimean Tatars and Crimeans should develop a joint strategy so that Ukraine recognize the rights of indigenous peoples in Ukraine. In 2014, we were very glad that Crimean Tatars were recognized indigenous peoples of Ukraine, and it would be reasonable if the same declarations our legislation make in terms of Crimean peoples, and we hope that the legislation will be adopted soon. We are very short of time, and we have two speakers. One is from the USA and from Russia. Pavlo Sulenziga is an advocate of indigenous people's rights in Russia. He is a representative of UDG peoples. They are only 1,200 peoples like Karaims in Ukraine. Pavel is not does not live in Russian Federation now because he is persecuted there. While we have been connected with him after Vyacheslav Lombroza's speech, I'd like to say that it is very relevant that we joined our efforts and draft a strategy and national plan on protection of indigenous people's rights. Pavlo, good morning. We would like to greet you on the World World's Indigenous Peoples Day. You have early morning in Russia. Thank you, Eskender. I would like to greet everyone. I am very glad to see Oliver, Boris, and I was glad to see those people who I know for a long time. I would like to congratulate everyone on the World's Day of Indigenous People. Today, unfortunately, Crimean Tatars celebrate their holiday not in their homes. I'm very glad to join your respected Honorable Assembly, your event. In fact, Indigenous people, sorry, bad connection. Can you please disconnect the video? We cannot hear you well, unfortunately. Using this chance, I'd like to say that when
Павел, извини, пожалуйста, мы не можем разобрать из-за связи, из-за технических моментов. Может быть, сейчас отключить видео, а включить только аудио, чтобы мы могли услышать?
Хорошо.
Вот сейчас хорошо слышим, Павел.
А сейчас как?
Now we hear you well. I'd like to say that often at various events, including at the UN events, the situation is often when the representation of indigenous peoples is needed. And the lawyers, advocates, they speak on behalf of indigenous people. Sorry, bad connection. I cannot hear. Very bad connection. Pavel, maybe you reconnect to us later because we do not hear you and we cannot understand you. In 5 minutes we will reconnect with you, and now we would like to have a Skype connection with Ms. Taipele, a representative of the United States of America, Indians of the United States of America. She is an advocate of indigenous people's rights and environmental rights, and she is a member of board Taina Kenny.
Yes, I hear you very good. Nice to meet you.
Likewise.
Thank you for joining us.
First of all, I want to congratulate all the indigenous peoples of the world on this special day. And I also want to thank you, Eskender, for inviting me. And I also want to thank our brother, Nadir Bekir, because he introduced us. So I am here for my brothers and sisters. It's really important for me to mention a few things. I see that I am the only person from this side of the world that is here with you this morning. So I will take the liberty to say that on behalf of all the indigenous peoples of this side of the world, we congratulate you and send you the best wishes. I have been listening, and as a Taino woman, and the Taino peoples are the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, the first ones to have encountered the Europeans and their invasion. I think it's very symbolic, because as peoples that have lost their territories for 527 years, it is the resilience that has kept us here, and we're still fighting for our rights. I have listened to the different speakers, and I want to mention a few things. This booklet, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, is something that everyone needs to learn about. Our people will not be able to defend rights that they do not recognize. Another aspect that I want to mention is the fact that Natalia spoke about having workshops. And I think that we need to take that at the local level as well. People need to understand what is entailed in this declaration. And this is also tied to the ILO 169. It's also connected to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And everything is interconnected. Another point that I want to make, it took almost 3 decades to adopt the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And as such, we cannot just think of this document an aspirational document. As our brother mentioned, there's a lot of connection, if we read the preamble, to treaties and conventions, and also for indigenous peoples. It is customary law, and that law has some weight. Our brother Oliver mentioned the terminology that we use. And even during this discussion, I have seen the other terms that come because we're accustomed to using them. The state uses them and so forth. And I think it's important that people know that S, when we talk about indigenous peoples, took a lot of effort and a lot of time to get it approved, to get it incorporated into this declaration. So we need to start being very conscientious about the use of language, and particularly the language that is described on this document. We need to be able to speak about that, and I think that training is one of the best things that could be done. I also want to say that even at the local level, we have to teach our people that whenever there's an issue, that they bring forth this declaration and connect it to the articles in there. My best wishes to you. I thank you again. I wish you much success, and my Crimean Tatars brothers and sisters have my support, and I am here, and my peoples are here. On behalf of the United Confederation of Taino People and the Caribbean Amerindian Development Organization, I thank you again for this wonderful invitation. I feel very honored. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Tai, dear sister. Thank you for your congratulations. Thank you for your participation. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
А сейчас я хочу все-таки...
Now I would like to try to reconnect with Pavlo Sulandziga from Russia. While we are connecting with him, if we have any questions. Are there questions? You are welcome. I have a short speech. My Berlin series this year, once in 3 years, of the People's Erza, I was elected to represent the people Erza. If we compare the Russia's and Ukraine's domain of indigenous people's rights protection, there is a big gap. This is first time when Erza peoples elected a person who is located not in Russia, because Ukraine for us is a territory where we can have assemblies freely and we can speak freely, while Russia only declares the rights, because Bashkirs, Udmurts, Ezra people's situation could not be compared with the indigenous people's situation in Ukraine. Formally, we have declarations, but our lands are contaminated. Our forests are being they are on fire, and our language is learned only once a week at schools, and the resolution 10 and 125 is a unique resolution when the victim country addresses the UN for the protection of rights of indigenous people on its occupied territories. So I would like to request the experts to criticize not where it is easy, but where the situation is very bad. My people's, Erza people's situation is now very bad, as well as the situation of Crimean Tatar people in Crimea. We should call on the global community to force Russia to deoccupy Crimea and Donbass. And the last thing, I often hear the calls on Ukrainian government that you should consider something. Friends, we can achieve good results if we respect each other. We can ask Ukraine how we can help. We should have respect. When Ukrainians pose demands on the part of the occupying country, this is really shocking. Do we have now connection with Pavlo? I would like to draw your attention that we are already beyond our schedule. I would like to use the chance to draw Ukrainian parliament and government's attention and the president's attention to the following. That Ukraine should adopt the law on indigenous peoples based on the UN Convention and Declaration, and to adopt the national plan of Ukraine on indigenous people's rights, to amend the 10th section of the Constitution of Ukraine, and the fourth, to consider the opportunity to ratify ILO's Convention 179, as it was mentioned today by our experts. And on the August 9, we believe that it would be reasonable that the President of Ukraine pronounced a statement that the occupying country should respect rights of indigenous people in Crimea. Every year, cultural and other events should be held in Ukraine, and they should be planned, such events like issuing coins and so on. Fifth, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs should communicate Ukraine's position on indigenous people's rights and the problems connected to Russian aggression and indigenous people's rights in Crimea. And after Ukraine in 2014 declared the accession to the Declaration on Indigenous People's Rights at the Permanent Forum of General Assembly of United Nations at the venue of United Nations, Ukraine may become an example for other countries in this domain. We shall try again to have connection with Pavlo, and if we fail, no connection. Then, on behalf of the participants, we would like to congratulate and thank Pavlo Sulandziga. He is an advocacy activist for many years in the domain of indigenous people's rights, and we are glad that he joined us at this event. But now we have no time, and we should finish this round-table discussion. Now 30 seconds for the last statements of our speakers. Very short comment. ILO Convention 179 has Article 15 Part 2 on the right of indigenous people for subsoils and other resources connected to their national heritage. And this will give us the basis to protect subsoils, natural resources in Crimea, like resources of Crimean Tatars people. This is important for harmonious development of these territories and the territory of all Ukraine.
Rather endorse Eskender's idea that Ukraine could be a leading player, at least in the Eastern European region, concerning the protection of the rights of indigenous peoples. Because if you look at this Eastern European region, and this is a geopolitical kind of, entity at the UN, then Ukraine is the only country in the Eastern European bloc that has endorsed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Russia has not, nor will it. However, Russia continues to have its experts placed in all those UN mechanisms that are supposed to promote the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This is absurd. So Ukraine has a moral right, and I would say responsibility, to follow up with its endorsement of the UN Declaration by making all necessary efforts to have it be much more represented at the UN and also domestically. And I think in this way Ukraine can actually show a good examples to the tens and tens of indigenous peoples in Russia, and also force Russia to improve its standards of protecting its own indigenous peoples.
Thank you. Pani Natalia.
У мене, по-перше, є побажання.
I have a wish to the working group created by the new representative of the new president, so that the work group members not start everything from scratch, but they use all huge work we have already done. We have already draft laws and amendments to the Article 10 of the Constitution. And I want to accent on the necessity to hold the trainings for MPs, which could be done before formal start of parliamentary sessions. Now our time is over. I would like to say that Natim Khalilov is in this hall with us, and he was deported from Crimea. And Crimean Tatar expert Salaman Amamotov is also present here, but unfortunately our time is over. We have Mejlis members here and journalists. We would like to thank all participants of this roundtable discussion. I hope that with this roundtable discussion we communicated information to Ukrainian citizens, Ukrainian civil servants and politicians and experts, and I hope that next year at the World's Indigenous Peoples Day we will report on the results of previous year. Thank you.